The Whitmore mansion had never seen chaos like this. 19 of the world's most decorated physicians crowded into a nursery that cost more than most neighborhoods. Their white coats are a blur of frantic movement under Swarovski chandeliers. Heart monitors screamed. Ventilators hissed. A team from Mass General barked orders at specialists flown in from Zurich, while a Pulitzer Prize-winning pediatric cardiologist wiped sweat from his brow and whispered what no one wanted to hear. "We're losing her." Baby Emma Whitmore, heiress to a $63 billion pharmaceutical empire, was dying, and $75,000 an hour in medical expertise couldn't tell anyone why. Her tiny body had turned the color of storm clouds. Blue lips, blue fingernails, a strange spotted rash spreading across her back like wildfire. Every test came back normal. Every treatment failed, and through the kitchen door window, pressing his face against glass that had never been touched by someone like him, stood Dante, 13 years old, son of the evening shift cook, wearing a jacket 4 winters too old and sneakers held together with duct tape and hope. He'd spent his whole life being invisible in this place. The boy who kept his head down, who noticed everything because no one ever noticed him. Right now, he was staring at the flowering vine on the nursery bookshelf. The one that had arrived 5 days ago. The one that had left a sticky amber residue on the decorator's gloves. Gloves that had touched the baby's changing table during yesterday's setup. The one that every genius in that room had walked past 23 times without a second glance. Dante's hands trembled. He knew what it was. His grandfather, who'd treated half of Southside Chicago with nothing but roots and knowledge, had taught him to recognize that vine pattern before he could tie his shoes. Oleander, widow's curse, angel's poison. The doctors were about to open that baby up, looking for answers inside. The answer was sitting in a ceramic pot wrapped in silk ribbon. Dante looked at the window, then at the security guard making rounds, then at his mother's face through the serving window, the woman who'd warned him 1,000 times. Stay invisible, stay safe. Don't give them a reason to remember we exist. He thought about what would happen if he was wrong. Then he thought about what would happen if he was right and did nothing. Dante pulled his jacket tight, took a breath that tasted like fear and courage mixed together, and ran toward the impossible. What would you risk to save a life that the world says isn't your responsibility to save? Dante had learned to walk without making sound by the time he was 5 years old. It wasn't a skill anyone had taught him. It was survival. When you lived in the converted carriage house at the back of a billionaire's estate, a space so cramped it could fit inside the Whitmore family's wine cellar, you learned quickly that your existence was permitted, not celebrated. You learned to move like mist, to breathe like silence, to become so small, so quiet, so utterly erasable, that the wealthy people gliding through their pristine lives never had to be reminded by your presence that inequality was real. His mother, Keisha, had worked for the Whitmore family for 9 years. She'd started when Dante was just 4, chopping vegetables on her feet for 12 hours, while women in $1,000 shoes complained about their personal trainers. She'd worked through a herniated disc, through the flu that nearly hospitalized her, and through the slow erosion of every ambition she'd ever held for herself, all so Dante could have a place to sleep and food that didn't come from a shelter. "We are fortunate," she would tell him every night, her voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been faith or might have been surrender. "Mr. Whitmore lets us stay here. He pays for your bus pass. We are fortunate, Dante. Don't ever forget that." Dante never argued with her, but he also never forgot the way the Whitmore children looked past him when they passed, like he was made of air, or maybe just nothing at all. He never forgot the time Robert Whitmore II had fired a landscaper for parking in the wrong spot during a conference call. He never forgot the policy posted in the service hallway. Staff must remain in designated areas. Visible presence in family spaces prohibited during operational hours. Fortunate. Right. If you're already hooked on Dante's story, you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this journey. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 54 acres of manufactured perfection in the hills overlooking the bay. There were gardens designed by landscape architects who'd won international awards, fountains carved from Carrara marble, and a topiary garden that had been featured in 5 design magazines. There was a private golf course, 2 helicopter pads, and an infinity pool that seemed to pour directly into the ocean below. There was a 15-car garage filled with vehicles that appreciated in value faster than most people's retirement accounts, and a climate-controlled art gallery that held paintings worth more than Dante's grandfather would have earned in 5 lifetimes. Dante knew every inch of it, not because he was allowed to explore, God no. He knew it because he'd spent his entire life watching from the periphery, from the tiny window of the carriage house when he was supposed to be sleeping, from behind the service vehicles when he was supposed to be waiting for the school bus, from the shadows of the delivery corridor when he snuck in to bring his mother the insulin she'd forgotten. He mapped the estate in his mind the way other kids mapped their favorite games. He knew which cameras had dead zones. He knew which doors had faulty locks that didn't quite catch. He knew that the head of security, a barrel-chested man named Pike, took a 15-minute coffee break behind the equipment shed every day at 3:45. He knew these things because knowing them made him feel like he had some measure of control in a world that constantly reminded him he had none. But lately, Dante had been watching for a different reason. 4 months ago, Victoria Whitmore had given birth to a baby girl, Emma Rose Whitmore, the heiress, the princess, the future of a dynasty built on patent medicine and real estate acquisitions and the kind of multi-generational wealth that ordinary people couldn't even imagine. The baby had arrived in a hurricane of media coverage and society pages. A celebrity photographer had been commissioned to document her first 24 hours. A rotating team of night nurses worked in 6-hour shifts. A pediatric nutritionist had been brought in from Copenhagen to optimize Mrs. Whitmore's postpartum diet. Dante had watched it all from his usual place, the margins, and somewhere along the way something had cracked open in his chest. He'd started adjusting his route to school, so he passed the nursery window at dawn when the nurse would lift Emma toward the sunrise. He'd started pausing near the service entrance when he knew the baby would be taken for her midday stroll through the sculpture garden. He'd started feeling something he couldn't quite articulate, a strange, painful tenderness for this tiny person who had everything Dante would never touch, but who also seemed so delicate, so vulnerable, so completely unaware of the gilded cage she'd been born into. Maybe it was because Emma was blameless. Maybe it was because Dante remembered what his grandfather used to say. "Every baby comes into this world clean, son. What happens after that? That's on the rest of us." Or maybe it was because Dante understood in some wordless way that he and Emma were both captives of circumstances they hadn't chosen. Emma would spend her life in a golden prison, performing for cameras and board meetings, and a father who saw her as a dynasty rather than a daughter. Dante would spend his life in the shadows, unseen and uncounted, his potential measured only by how successfully he stayed out of sight. 2 children, 2 cages, same estate. It was a Wednesday evening when Dante first saw the vine. He was walking back from school, taking his usual route along the maintenance road that ran behind the mansion's north wing. The spring air was sharp with the smell of fresh-cut grass and coming rain, and Dante had his jacket pulled tight against the chill, the same jacket he'd been wearing for 4 years now, the one with the fading sleeves and the zipper that stuck halfway up. A florist's van was parked near the service entrance. This wasn't unusual. The Whitmores received deliveries constantly. Everything from aged wines to custom furniture to specialty baby formula flown in from organic farms in New Zealand. But something about this delivery made Dante slow his steps. The florist was carrying a vine. It was stunning, Dante had to admit. About 3 feet long with glossy dark leaves that seemed to catch the light like wet paint. Delicate pink flowers hung in elegant clusters, soft as tissue paper with yellow centers like drops of honey. The pot was wrapped in an elaborate white bow, and a card was nestled among the tendrils. Old Mr. Chen, the head groundskeeper, met the florist at the door. Dante watched from behind the utility truck as Chen signed for the package, his weathered hands reaching out to steady the container. And then Dante saw it. When Chen's fingers brushed against the stems, they came away shining with something. A residue, amber-colored and faintly viscous, like tree sap, but wrong somehow. Chen noticed it too. Dante saw him frown down at his work gloves, rubbing his fingers together with a confused expression. But then the florist said something, and Chen nodded, and the moment passed. He carried the vine inside, presumably toward the nursery where all the congratulatory gifts were arranged, and Dante was left standing in the shadows with a cold dread settling in his stomach. He knew that vine. He couldn't remember from where, not exactly, but something about those leaves, those flowers, that amber residue. It pulled at a memory buried deep in his consciousness. His grandfather's voice, maybe from those summers he'd spent with him on the South Side before he passed. He'd taught Dante about plants the way other grandfathers taught their grandchildren about sports or fishing. He'd walked him through the community garden, pointing out which roots could cure and which could kill, which flowers were remedies and which were poison dressed in beauty. The devil's prettiest work, he used to say, always comes wrapped in something lovely. You have to learn to see past the pretty to the danger underneath. Dante stood there for a long moment, that dread growing heavier with every heartbeat. He thought about going to find his mother. He thought about knocking on the service entrance and telling someone, anyone, that something about that vine felt dangerous. But who would listen to him? He was invisible, the cook's kid, the shadow boy. He didn't even register in the Whitmore's world except as a minor complication to be managed. So Dante did what he always did. He swallowed his instincts, buried his dread, and walked back to the carriage house to start his homework. 5 days later, he would realize that decision almost cost a baby her life. The sirens came at dusk. Dante was sitting at the rickety kitchen table, working through an algebra problem he didn't really understand when he heard them. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer, more frantic. He went to the window and watched as 4 ambulances came screaming up the private drive, followed by a convoy of black SUVs and 3 helicopters that descended onto the lawn like metal vultures. His mother burst through the carriage house door minutes later, her face ashen and her hands shaking. "Something's wrong with the baby," she gasped, already reaching for her work apron. "Something's terribly wrong. They're calling in doctors from everywhere. I have to go help. I have to." She was gone before Dante could form a word. He stood at the window for hours that night, watching the mansion glow with emergency lights, watching figures in white coats rush back and forth past the nursery window, watching the shadows of panic dance across the manicured grounds, and deep in his gut, beneath the fear and the confusion and the strange ache he felt for a baby he'd never even touched, one thought kept surfacing like a scream in dark water. The vine. The vine. The vine. Dante has seen something the doctors haven't. But will anyone listen to a poor black boy from the margins? The Whitmore mansion had transformed into a battlefield. Dante had never seen anything like it. Through the nursery window, the same window he'd pressed his face against 1,000 times to catch glimpses of baby Emma sleeping peacefully in her hand-carved French crib, he could now see nothing but controlled chaos. White coats everywhere, machines he couldn't name, blinking and beeping and wailing in electronic panic, hands moving with desperate precision, injecting, adjusting, measuring, failing, always failing. He'd crept closer than he should have. Much closer. The security teams were too consumed by the medical emergency to patrol their usual routes, and Dante had slipped through the sculpture garden like smoke, positioning himself behind the marble fountain where he had a clear sightline into the nursery's wall-to-wall windows. What he saw made his blood freeze. Baby Emma, tiny, precious Emma, who Dante had watched learn to track faces with her eyes, was the color of a thunderstorm. Her small body lay in the center of a medical cyclone, surrounded by more equipment than Dante had ever seen in one place. Tubes snaked from her arms. Monitors tracked heartbeats that stuttered and stumbled like a broken metronome. And her skin, God, her skin had gone from blue to gray like concrete, mottled with a rash that seemed to spread even as Dante watched. She looked like she was dying. She looked like she was already gone and just hadn't stopped breathing yet. If this story is gripping your heart the way it gripped mine writing it, you need to subscribe right now. What happens next will stay with you forever. Don't miss it. The doctors had started arriving within 90 minutes of the first ambulance. Dante had counted them as they came, black cars and helicopters depositing an army of medical royalty onto the Whitmore lawn. He'd heard his mother whispering their names to another kitchen worker in terrified reverence as she rushed past the carriage house. Dr. Franz Weber from the Institute of Pediatric Excellence in Munich. Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, the London neurologist who'd treated the British Prime Minister's granddaughter. Dr. David Lancaster from Stanford Medical, whose consultation fee was rumored to be $65,000 just to show up. Dr. Priya Kapoor, the Indian-American immunologist who'd been shortlisted for a Nobel Prize. Dr. Thomas Wright, Dr. Jennifer Kim, Dr. Alessandro Ricci, Dr. Nina Volkov, 19 of them. 19 of the most accomplished medical minds on the planet, each one carrying degrees from institutions Dante could never dream of attending, each one armed with knowledge that had taken decades and fortunes to acquire. 19 experts and not a single answer. Dante could see them through the window arguing now. Dr. Weber was gesturing emphatically at a monitor while Dr. Lancaster shook his head. Dr. Okonkwo had stepped back from the cluster, her arms crossed, her face troubled. A younger doctor, Dante didn't know his name, was running yet another blood panel while a nurse changed yet another IV bag. They were lost. Dante could see it in their body language, in the way their authoritative postures had begun to crumble as the hours crawled past. These titans of medicine, these masters of the healing sciences, were standing in a $52 million nursery with every resource on Earth at their disposal, and they had no idea why a 4-month-old baby was dying in front of them. Robert Whitmore stood in the corner of the room, and Dante had never seen a man look so shattered. The billionaire who dominated conference rooms and crushed rivals and moved through the world like he owned the air itself, which in many ways he did, was gripping his wife's hand with white-knuckled terror. Victoria Whitmore hadn't stopped crying for hours. Her designer outfit was rumpled, her perfect makeup ruined, her magazine cover composure destroyed into a million pieces on the French limestone floor. Their baby was dying, and all their wealth couldn't stop it. This is the moment everything changes. Dante's about to do something that will shock everyone, including himself. Dante watched the doctors cycle through their theories. Bacterial sepsis. They flooded Emma with antibiotics that did nothing. Viral encephalitis. They tried antivirals that made no difference. Autoimmune crisis. They administered immunosuppressants that didn't suppress anything. Chromosomal abnormality. They ran genetic tests that came back unremarkable. Anaphylactic shock. They injected her with epinephrine that might as well have been saline. Each theory emerged with confidence and collapsed in confusion. Each treatment was administered with precision and failed with finality. Dante watched it all through the window, his hands pressed against the cold stone of the fountain, his heart hammering against his rib cage. Because he knew something they didn't. He knew about the vine. It was still there. He could see it from where he crouched, sitting on the bookshelf near the nursery window, its pale pink flowers catching the harsh emergency lights, its dark leaves shimmering with that amber sheen. The doctors walked past it constantly. They adjusted their equipment around it. They set their tablets and coffee cups and medical charts down next to it without a glance. It was invisible to them, part of the decorative background, just like Dante. He remembered his grandfather's lessons now, the memories surfacing with painful clarity. They'd been sitting in the community garden on the south side. The summer Dante was 8, and he'd been showing him pictures in an old botanical book with a water-stained cover. "This one here," he'd said, pointing to an illustration of pink flowers that looked almost exactly like the ones in the nursery, "we call it oleander. The medical folks call it cardiac glycoside toxin. Pretty, yes, but the sap on those stems, just touching it, can stop a grown man's heart cold. And if you're tiny, if you're a baby, He'd shaken his head slowly. Even breathing near it for days can poison the blood until everything shuts down. Dante's grandfather had known things that no medical school taught. He'd learned his healing knowledge from his father, who'd learned from his father, who'd learned from ancestors who'd had nothing but the plants around them and the wisdom passed down through generations of necessity. He'd delivered babies in apartments with no heat. He'd treated infections with poultices and teas when there was no money for hospitals. He'd saved lives with knowledge that the fancy physicians would have called folklore. And he'd taught Dante not everything. He died before he could finish, taken by a heart attack when Dante was 10, leaving him with fragments of his wisdom rattling around in his head like treasures in a locked box. But he taught him enough to recognize the shape of those leaves, enough to remember the warning about the amber residue, enough to understand with growing horror what he was watching happen to baby Emma. The doctors were looking for something inside the baby. They were analyzing her blood for pathogens, examining her organs for defects, searching her DNA for mutations. They were looking in the wrong place. The enemy wasn't inside Emma. It was sitting 4 feet away from her crib, wrapped in a white bow, beautiful as a painting and deadly as a bullet. Dante knows the truth, but knowing isn't the same as acting, and what he's about to do will cost him everything. The hours crawled past like dying things. Dante stayed at his position behind the fountain, unable to leave, unable to stop watching. His legs cramped. His fingers went numb from the cold. His mother would be searching for him soon, frantic with worry, but he couldn't make himself move. He watched Dr. Lancaster call a conference in the corner of the nursery, gathering the other 19 physicians into a huddle of expensive credentials and grave expressions. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could read their body language, the head shakes, the open palms, the defeat settling over them like dust. They were giving up. No, not giving up, transitioning. Dante saw one of the doctors gesture toward the door, toward wherever the surgical suite had been prepared. He saw another doctor begin prepping what looked like surgical instruments. They were going to open that baby up. They were going to cut through her tiny body searching for an answer that wasn't there, and the surgery would stress her already collapsing system past the point of survival, and Emma would die on an operating table surrounded by 19 useless degrees. Dante's hands curled into fists. He thought about his mother, about what would happen to her if he did what he was thinking about doing. She'd lose her job, that was guaranteed. They'd be thrown off the estate, probably arrested for trespassing, maybe worse. Everything she'd sacrificed for 9 years would be destroyed because her son couldn't keep his head down and stay invisible like he was supposed to. He thought about himself, about how simple it would be to just walk away, to go back to the carriage house and pretend he hadn't seen anything, hadn't understood anything. He was nobody, the cook's kid. What happened to Billionaire's babies wasn't his concern, wasn't his business. He could keep his head down, finish school, maybe get a scholarship somewhere, build something of his life without taking this insane risk. He thought about his grandfather, about the way he'd looked at him when he taught him about plants, about healing, about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of people who'd had nothing but each other and the earth beneath their feet. "This wisdom is your inheritance," he told him. "Not money, not property. This what I'm putting in your head right now. Promise me you'll use it when it counts." He'd promised. He'd promised. And then he'd spent years being ashamed of that inheritance, being embarrassed by the grandfather who'd never gone to college, who'd spoken with an accent that made people assume he was ignorant, who'd healed with roots and prayers when real doctors used technology and pharmaceuticals. He'd wanted to be modern, educated, acceptable. He'd wanted to be anything other than the descendant of people who'd had to figure out their own medicine because no one else would help them. But right now, in this moment, that inheritance was the only thing that could save Emma's life, and Dante was the only one who carried it. What would you do? Would you risk everything, your home, your mother's job, your entire future for a baby whose family has never even acknowledged your existence? Dante is about to make his choice. Dante looked at the nursery window one more time. Emma's monitors were declining. The doctors were mobilizing now, shouting orders, preparing for emergency surgery that Dante knew in his bones would kill the baby faster than the poison already destroying her system. He thought about what his grandfather would do, and then Dante stood up from behind the fountain, stepped out of the shadows that had concealed him his entire life, and started running toward the mansion. He had no plan, no strategy, no idea how he was going to get past security, past the doctors, past Robert Whitmore himself. He only knew that he had to try, that if he walked away now and that baby died, he would carry the weight of it forever, that some things mattered more than staying safe, more than staying invisible, more than protecting a life that wasn't really living anyway. His feet pounded against the manicured grass. The cold air burned his lungs. Somewhere behind him, a security guard shouted in alarm. Dante didn't stop. He was done being a shadow. Dante is running toward the impossible, toward armed guards and furious doctors and a billionaire who could destroy his life with a single phone call. What happens next will either make him a hero or a criminal, possibly both. Dante hit the service entrance at full speed. The door was unlocked, thank God for small mercies and distracted staff, and he burst through it into the chaos of the kitchen. Caterers who'd been hired for a fundraiser that would never happen stood frozen at their stations, their faces pale with the reflected anxiety of the medical crisis happening upstairs. A pastry chef dropped a copper bowl with a crash that echoed through the marble halls. Someone screamed. Dante didn't stop. He knew this house. He'd memorized every corridor, every shortcut, every back stairway that the family never used but the staff traveled daily. His feet carried him through the kitchen, past the walk-in freezer, toward the narrow service staircase that wound up to the second floor like a secret artery hidden inside the mansion's pristine body. Hey, stop right there. Pike, the head of security." Dante heard the man's heavy footsteps thundering behind him, heard the crackle of a radio as Pike called for reinforcements. But Dante was smaller, faster, and desperate in a way that Pike couldn't comprehend. He took the stairs 4 at a time, his worn sneakers slipping on the polished wood, his hand gripping the railing so hard his knuckles ached. Second floor, north wing. The nursery was at the end of the hall, past the family portraits and the Ming vases and the hand-painted wallpaper that cost more per square foot than his mother made in 6 weeks. 3 more guards appeared at the top of the stairs. Dante's heart seized. They were massive, all of them, with shoulders like mountains and expressions that said they'd been waiting their whole careers for a chance to tackle someone. They spread out, blocking the hallway, arms extended like they were corralling livestock. "Kid, you need to stop right now," one of them said, his voice carrying that false calm that adults used when they were about to do something violent. "You're trespassing on private property. Whatever's going on, we can handle it, but you need to." Dante faked right. The guard bit. He lunged in that direction, his massive body committed to the movement, and Dante spun left, ducking under the second guard's grasping arms with a move he'd learned dodging bullies at the bus stop. He felt fingers brush his jacket, that old worn jacket with the stuck zipper, and then he was past them, sprinting down the corridor toward the nursery door. Dante is fighting for his life and Emma's, but the hardest part hasn't even started yet. The nursery door was closed. Dante could hear voices on the other side, urgent, overlapping medical terminology he didn't understand, mixed with the steady electronic wail of machines losing their battle. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle and threw the door open with enough force to send it slamming against the wall. 19 heads turned toward him. 19 faces registered shock, then confusion, then fury. The room smelled like disinfectant and fear and something else, something sweet and faintly rotten that Dante recognized immediately. The vine, its poison was in the air itself, had been slowly saturating the nursery for days. "What the hell, security? Who is this kid? Get him out of here!" The voices crashed over him like waves, but Dante's eyes were fixed on one thing only, the crib in the center of the room, surrounded by machines and monitors and men in white coats who'd already started to turn back to their work, dismissing him as a minor disruption to be handled by others. Emma lay in that crib, her tiny chest barely moving. Her skin had gone from blue to gray like ash, like something already dead. The rash had spread across her entire back now, an angry map of raised welts that the doctors had biopsied and analyzed and tested without understanding. She was dying, minutes now, maybe less. Robert Whitmore stepped forward, his face a mask of grief and rage and desperate confusion. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "Guards, get this. This boy out of my daughter's room immediately." The guards were already on Dante. He felt hands grip his shoulders, felt himself being lifted off his feet, felt the world tilting as they started to drag him backward toward the door. "The vine!" Dante screamed, fighting against the grip with everything he had. "It's the vine, the one on the bookshelf. It's oleander. It's poison." The guards didn't stop. Of course they didn't stop. He was just a kid, a poor kid, a black kid in a dirty jacket, screaming nonsense in a room full of the greatest medical minds in the world. Why would anyone listen to him? "Please," Dante's voice cracked, broke, reformed into something raw and pleading. "My grandfather, he taught me about plants. That one is oleander. It's toxic. The sap gets on everything it touches, and the baby's been breathing it for days. You have to get it out of here. You have to." "Remove him," Robert Whitmore said coldly. "Now. This is the moment that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. What Dante does next will haunt you." Something inside Dante snapped. Not broke, snapped, like a wire stretched too far, like a bone pushed past its limit. He'd spent his entire life being invisible, being quiet, being good. He'd swallowed his voice 1,000 times, bitten back his thoughts, made himself small, so that the wealthy and the powerful wouldn't be troubled by his existence. And where had it gotten him? Here. Being dragged out of a room by guards while a baby died because no one would listen to the cook's son. Dante went limp in the guard's arms, a trick he learned from watching animal videos online. How prey sometimes played dead to confuse predators. The guard's grip loosened just slightly, their bodies adjusting to what they thought was surrender. Then Dante twisted. He dropped his weight suddenly, slipping downward through their grasp like water through fingers. His elbow caught one guard in the ribs, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to surprise. He scrambled forward on hands and knees, moving faster than they could react, weaving between the legs of startled doctors. Someone grabbed his ankle. He kicked free. Someone else blocked his path. He rolled sideways. The room had erupted into chaos. Doctors shouting, guards cursing, equipment crashing as people stumbled into machines. But Dante had eyes only for the crib, for the tiny gray figure lying still as stone inside it. He reached the crib, his hands closed around Emma's small body, so light, so terribly light, like holding a bundle of dried flowers, and he lifted the baby against his chest. Emma's head lolled against Dante's shoulder. Her breathing was so shallow Dante could barely feel it. "Put her down." Robert Whitmore's voice had gone beyond rage into something primal, something animal. "Put my daughter down right now, or I swear to God." But Dante was already moving, not toward the door. The guards had that blocked. Toward the bathroom, the attached bathroom that he knew existed because he'd seen the floor plans once, left carelessly on the kitchen counter by a contractor making upgrades. He made it through the door and slammed it behind him, fumbling with the lock as bodies crashed against the wood. The door shuddered but held. It wouldn't hold for long. These weren't security doors designed for protection. They were designer doors designed to look elegant, and the guards would break through in seconds. Dante looked around the bathroom wildly. Marble counters, gold fixtures, a cabinet full of luxury baby products that cost more than his school supplies. And there on the counter, a small jar of activated charcoal powder, the kind wealthy parents bought for natural baby care, for face masks and teeth whitening and detox treatments they read about in lifestyle magazines. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Charcoal pulls poison from the body, son. The old folks used to burn wood and grind it up for exactly this. It binds to the toxins, carries them out." The door shuddered again. Wood splintered. Dante moved on instinct now, operating on knowledge that lived in his bones rather than his brain. He grabbed the charcoal powder with one hand while cradling Emma with the other. He turned on the faucet, cold water because he didn't have time to wait for warm, and wet his fingers. Emma's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, but alive. Still alive. "I'm sorry," Dante whispered. "I'm so sorry. This is going to feel weird, but I promise I'm trying to help you. I promise." He mixed the charcoal with water in his palm, creating a thin black paste. He tilted Emma's head back gently, carefully, the way he'd seen his grandfather do with sick children in the neighborhood when he'd administered his remedies. The door exploded inward. This is it. The moment of truth. Everything Dante has risked, his home, his mother's job, his freedom, comes down to the next few seconds. Dante got the charcoal mixture into Emma's mouth just as the guards reached him. Hands grabbed him from every direction, rough, angry hands that didn't care about being gentle. He felt his arm twist painfully behind his back, felt his knees hit the marble floor, felt the baby being torn from his grasp. "No!" Dante screamed. "Don't wipe her mouth. Don't make her throw up. The charcoal needs time to work. Please, please, just give it 10 minutes. But no one was listening. Robert Whitmore was cradling his daughter now, his face twisted with fury and terror. The doctors were swarming, checking Emma's vitals, examining the black residue around her tiny mouth. Victoria Whitmore had collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. "What did you give her?" Dr. Lancaster demanded, grabbing Dante by the collar. "What did you put in that baby's mouth?" "Activated charcoal," Dante gasped. The guard's knee was on his back now, pressing him into the cold marble floor. "Just charcoal. It's not dangerous. It absorbs toxins. My grandfather used to." "Your grandfather?" Dr. Lancaster's voice dripped with contempt. "You assaulted a critically ill infant based on your grandfather's advice." "The vine," Dante said desperately. "Please just test the vine, the one on the nursery bookshelf. It's oleander. The sap contains cardiac glycosides. It's been poisoning her for days through skin contact and inhalation. The charcoal will help bind what's already in her system, but you have to get that vine out of here or she'll keep getting worse. Please, I'm begging you, just test the vine." No one moved, and then her colors changing. It was Dr. Okonkwo. She was standing closest to Robert Whitmore, closest to Emma, and her voice carried that particular quality of scientific observation that cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "What?" Robert Whitmore looked down at his daughter. "Her color," Dr. Okonkwo repeated slowly. She's pinking up. Her oxygen saturation is rising." Silence fell over the bathroom like a held breath. Dante couldn't see Emma from his position on the floor, but he could see the faces of the doctors. He watched shock replace skepticism, watched confusion replace contempt, watched 19 world-renowned physicians realize that something impossible was happening, that their understanding of medicine was being challenged by a 13-year-old boy with a handful of charcoal. "That's not possible," Dr. Lancaster said flatly. "Activated charcoal can't work that fast. There's no mechanism by which her heart rhythm is stabilizing." Dr. Okonkwo had pulled out a portable monitor, was pressing it to Emma's tiny chest. Sinus rhythm normalizing, blood pressure coming up, respiratory rate improving. "The rash," Victoria Whitmore whispered. "Oh my God, look at the rash." Dante couldn't see, but he heard the gasps that told him everything. The angry welts were fading. The poison that had been strangling Emma's system was being bound, neutralized, pulled away by the simple black powder that Dante's grandfather had kept in his medicine cabinet next to the aspirin and the cough syrup. "Get off him," Robert Whitmore said quietly. The guard's knee pressed harder into Dante's back. "Sir," I said, "get off him." Robert Whitmore's voice was different now. The rage was gone, replaced by something Dante couldn't identify. "Get off that boy right now." The pressure on Dante's spine released. He stayed where he was for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Then slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up to his knees. Robert Whitmore was staring at him. Emma was staring at him too, the baby's eyes clear now, focused, tracking Dante's face with something that might have been recognition. "The vine," Dante said one more time. his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just test the vine." Dr. Lancaster walked out of the bathroom. 3 minutes later, Dante heard him shout from the nursery. "Get a hazmat team in here now. Everyone who touched that plant needs to wash their hands immediately, and someone call poison control. I need everything they have on oleander toxicity in infants." Dante closed eyes. It was over. One way or another, it was over. Emma was going to live, and Dante had no idea what was going to happen to him next. Emma saved. But now comes the aftermath, and the questions that could destroy everything. Who sent that vine? And what will Robert Whitmore do with the boy who broke into his home, assaulted his staff, and forced medicine down his infant daughter's throat? The next 8 hours passed in a blur of fluorescent lights and hushed conversations. Dante sat in a chair outside the nursery, not the servants' quarters, not the security office, not a police interrogation room, a chair right there in the hallway where anyone walking past could see him, where Robert Whitmore had personally told him to wait. No one had put him in handcuffs. No one had called the police. No one had dragged him off the property or threatened to press charges or done any of the things Dante had been certain would happen the moment he'd crashed through that service entrance door. Instead, they brought him water, a sandwich, a blanket when one of the nurses noticed he was shivering. He didn't understand any of it. Through the nursery doorway, he could see Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib. The baby's color had returned to normal, warm brown skin instead of that terrible, deathly gray. Her monitors beeped steadily now, tracking vital signs that climbed stronger with every passing hour. The army of doctors had thinned to just 4, running final tests, conferring in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the hallway where Dante sat wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe. Dr. Okonkwo had been the first to apologize. She'd come out of the nursery around 2 a.m., her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. She'd stood in front of Dante's chair, looked at him for a long moment, and then bowed her head. "I was wrong," she said simply. "We were all wrong. You saw what we couldn't see, and you saved that child's life. I'm sorry we didn't listen." Dante hadn't known what to say. He'd mumbled something, "Thank you maybe, or it's okay," and Dr. Okonkwo had nodded once and walked away. This story started with a boy in the shadows. Now the whole world is about to see him. If you've made it this far, you need to see it through to the end. Subscribe now. The best part is still coming. The investigation began before sunrise. Robert Whitmore had called in a private security firm, not the guards who patrolled his estate, but a team of former Secret Service agents and forensic specialists who arrived in unmarked vehicles and set up a command center in the mansion's west wing. Dante watched them work through the windows, unpacking equipment, photographing the nursery, carefully removing the vine in a sealed container. Around 7 a.m., an investigator approached Dante's chair. "Mr. Whitmore wants to speak with you," she said. Her voice was neutral, professional. "Are you up for that?" Dante's stomach tightened. This was it. The moment when the gratitude would end and the reality would begin. The moment when Robert Whitmore would remember that Dante was still a trespasser, still a nobody, still the cook's son who'd broken into his home and put his hands on his infant daughter without permission. "Yes, ma'am," Dante said. Because what else could he say? She led him down the corridor, past the family portraits and the Ming vases he'd sprinted past hours earlier, past the service staircase where he'd dodged the guards, past 100 small reminders of the invisible barriers he'd spent his whole life never crossing. Robert Whitmore was waiting in his study. Dante had never been inside this room. He'd glimpsed it through doorways, seen the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the massive walnut desk and the windows that overlooked the gardens where Dante's mother sometimes worked. But standing here now, surrounded by more wealth than his entire extended family would earn in 20 lifetimes, he felt smaller than he'd ever felt before. "Sit down, Dante." It was the first time Robert Whitmore had ever said his name. Dante sat. Robert Whitmore looked like a man who'd aged 20 years in a single night. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, and something deeper, something that looked like the shattering of everything he believed about his own power. He was holding a folder in his hands, thick with papers, and his fingers were trembling slightly as he turned the pages. The vine, Robert began slowly, was a gift. It arrived 5 days ago with a card congratulating my wife and me on Emma's 4-month milestone. The card was signed by Vincent Drexler. Dante didn't recognize the name, but he saw the way Robert's jaw tightened when he said it. Vincent Drexler was my business partner. We built Whitmore Drexler Pharmaceuticals together 26 years ago, working out of a storage unit in Newark. He was the best man at my wedding, Emma's godfather. Robert's voice cracked on the last word. I trusted him with everything, my company, my family, my daughter. The truth behind the poison gift is more devastating than anyone imagined. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. The forensic team had found traces of the vine's toxic sap on the groundskeeper's gloves, the same gloves that had been used to adjust Emma's crib mobile. They'd found residue on the nursery bookshelf, on the curtains, on the stuffed animals that hung above the baby's bed. The vine had been shedding its poison steadily for 5 days, saturating the room with invisible death. But that wasn't all they'd found. The florist that had delivered the vine kept meticulous records, security cameras, GPS tracking, digital signatures. Within hours, the investigators had traced the package back to its source. Not a legitimate greenhouse or botanical garden, but a private laboratory that specialized in rare toxic specimens. The laboratory was owned by a shell corporation. The shell corporation was funded by accounts in the Cayman Islands. The accounts had been opened by Vincent Drexler. He wanted my daughter dead, Robert said, and his voice was barely human anymore. It was the sound of something breaking apart from the inside. He wanted to destroy me, and he chose the most precious thing in my life to do it, because I bought him out, because the board chose my vision over his, because I got majority control and he got pushed out with nothing but a settlement and a non-compete clause. Dante sat very still. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he was supposed to say anything. Do you know what the worst part is? Robert continued. The doctors would never have figured it out. Never. They were so focused on their blood tests and their imaging scans and their genetic analyses, so certain that the answer had to be something complex, something that matched their training, that they never once looked around the room, never once asked what had changed in Emma's environment, never once considered that the simplest explanation might be the right one. He looked at Dante with something that might have been wonder. But you did. Dante shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My grandfather taught me about plants. He said that rich doctors always look for rich problems. Sometimes the answer is just sitting there in front of everyone. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was. Dante's throat tightened. He died when I was 10. He was going to teach me more, but he ran out of time. Robert nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder in his hands, at the evidence of betrayal by someone he'd loved like a brother. Then he pressed a button on his desk phone. Send them in, he said. Everything Dante thought he knew about his life is about to change. The door opened and Dante's mother walked in. Keisha looked like she'd been crying for hours. Her uniform was disheveled, her hair escaping from its usually perfect bun, her eyes swollen and red. Behind her came Victoria Whitmore, still in the clothes she'd been wearing during the crisis, holding Emma against her chest like she would never let her go again. Dante. Keisha rushed to her son, pulling him into an embrace so tight he could barely breathe. Dante, baby, I was so scared. They told me what you did. They told me you broke in and the guards chased you and you, Mama. I'm okay. Dante hugged her back, breathing in the familiar scent of laundry soap and the commercial cleaner she used on the Whitmore floors. I'm okay. Emma's okay. Everything's okay. You could have been arrested. Keisha pulled back to look at him, her hands gripping his shoulders. You could have been hurt. He could have saved himself the trouble and done nothing. Robert Whitmore interrupted quietly. He could have stayed in your carriage house and let my daughter die while 19 doctors fumbled in the dark, but he didn't. Keisha turned to look at the billionaire, and Dante saw fear flash across her face, the deep, instinctive fear of someone who'd spent their whole life at the mercy of powerful people. But Robert didn't look angry. He looked humbled. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, using his mother's last name with a respect Dante had never heard from anyone on this estate. "Your son is the only reason my daughter is alive right now. The doctors failed. The security failed. I failed. But Dante—" Robert's voice broke. He stopped, composed himself, started again. Dante ran into a building full of people who saw him as a threat. He fought through guards who could have seriously hurt him. He grabbed a critically ill baby and administered a treatment that went against everything the medical experts were saying. He did all of that knowing that if he was wrong, it would ruin both your lives. "He wasn't wrong," Victoria Whitmore said softly. She stepped forward, Emma sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. "He was right. He was the only one who was right." She looked at Dante and there were tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my baby." Dante didn't know what to do with the gratitude of rich people. He'd spent his whole life avoiding their notice, and now here they were looking at him like he was something precious instead of something to be managed. I couldn't let her die," Dante said awkwardly. "Not when I knew what was wrong. Not when I could do something about it." "That's exactly the point," Robert said. He stood up from his desk, walked around it, and did something Dante never expected in a million years. He knelt down in front of Dante's chair, a billionaire on his knees, looking up at the cook's son. "I've spent my entire life believing that money and education and connections were the only things that mattered," Robert said. "I built walls around this estate to keep out the people I thought were beneath me. I hired guards to protect my family from threats I imagined in the shadows. And the whole time, the real threat walked right through my front door in a beautiful pot with a white bow, and the only person who could see it was the boy I'd taught my staff to ignore." He reached out and took Dante's hand. "I was wrong about so many things, and I don't know how to make that right, but I'm going to try." The boy in the shadows is about to step into the light permanently, but his story isn't over yet. Vincent Drexler was arrested the next morning. Dante watched it happen from the nursery window, watched the police cars roll up the driveway, watched the man who tried to murder a baby get led away in handcuffs while camera flashes exploded around him. The story had leaked somehow, and news vans were lined up along the estate's perimeter, reporters shouting questions that no one answered. But the arrest was only the beginning. Robert Whitmore didn't just want justice, he wanted obliteration. Within 10 days, he'd mobilized an army of lawyers to dismantle everything Vincent Drexler had built: the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the stock portfolios and real estate holdings and country club memberships. Every piece of the empire that Drexler had constructed on a foundation of resentment and rage. "He'll die in prison," Robert told Dante during one of their now daily conversations. The billionaire had taken to seeking Dante out, asking him questions about plants and healing and the grandfather who taught him things that medical schools didn't know. The charges are attempted murder of a child. Even white-collar criminals don't survive that. Dante nodded. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in Robert's presence, still felt the weight of the class divide that had defined his entire life. But something had shifted between them, something real. "What happens now?" Dante asked. "To the estate, I mean, to everything." Robert smiled, a tired smile, but a real one. "Now," he said, "we tear down the walls." He meant it literally. Over the following weeks, Dante watched as construction crews dismantled the fences that had surrounded the Whitmore property. The guard towers came down. The staff-only signs disappeared. The service entrance was sealed, and a new main entrance was built, one that everyone used regardless of their position. But Robert wasn't done. "There's going to be a medical center," he announced at a press conference that Dante watched from the crowd, standing between his mother and Victoria Whitmore. A free clinic open to everyone in the community, focused on accessible care and traditional medicine. It's going to be staffed by doctors who know how to listen, who know how to look at the whole picture instead of just the test results. He paused and his eyes found Dante's in the crowd. It's going to be called the Malcolm Jenkins Healing Center, named after the man who taught his grandson the knowledge that saved my daughter's life. Dante's vision blurred. His grandfather's name on a building, a real building where real people would receive real help because of something he'd taught him in a community garden 5 years ago. Keisha was crying beside him, not the scared tears he'd seen so many times before, tears of worry about rent and job security and whether they'd make it through another month. These were different. These were the tears of someone who just realized that their sacrifices had meant something. "There's one more thing," Robert said into the microphones. "My family owes a debt we can never fully repay, so we're starting with what we can do." He announced the scholarship fund. Full tuition to any university in the world for Dante and any future children Keisha might have. He announced the house, not the carriage house, but a real house on the property with Dante's name on the deed alongside his mother's. He announced a position for Keisha on the board of the new medical center, with a salary that made her gasp when she heard the number. But for Dante, the most important announcement was smaller, quieter. Something Robert said to him privately after the cameras had left and the reporters had filed their stories. "I'm setting up an apprenticeship," Robert said, "with the best botanical researchers in the world. If you want it, so you can learn everything your grandfather didn't get the chance to teach you, so you can become the kind of healer he was raising you to be." Dante thought about his grandfather, about the promise he'd made to him, to use his wisdom when it mattered, about all the years he'd spent being ashamed of his inheritance, wishing he could be something more respectable. He'd been wrong about that, so wrong. His grandfather's knowledge wasn't something to overcome. It was something to build on, a foundation of wisdom that stretched back generations, waiting for him to add his own layer to the structure. "Yes," Dante said. "I want that more than anything." Robert nodded, and then he did something that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. He pulled Dante into a hug, holding him the way Dante imagined fathers held their sons. "Thank you," Robert whispered, "for being brave when it mattered, for being the person I should have seen all along." Dante hugged him back. He wasn't invisible anymore. The poison gift has been exposed. The villain has been caught. But Dante's transformation isn't complete yet. Chapter 5 reveals the new legacy, the one that Dante will build on the foundation his grandfather left him. 18 months later, Dante stood in front of a building that bore his grandfather's name. The Malcolm Jenkins Healing Center gleamed in the afternoon sun, its glass walls reflecting the gardens that surrounded it, gardens that Dante himself had helped design, filling them with the medicinal plants his grandfather had taught him to recognize. Lavender for calm, peppermint for digestion, echinacea for immunity, and in one carefully controlled greenhouse, a collection of toxic specimens behind locked doors, used to train the next generation of doctors to see what 19 experts had once missed. Today was the grand opening. Dante tugged at the collar of his new suit, a gift from Emma Whitmore, tailored to fit him perfectly, made from fabric softer than anything he'd ever worn. He still wasn't entirely comfortable in clothes like these. Part of him probably never would be, but he was learning that discomfort wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it meant you were growing into a new version of yourself. "You ready?" His mother appeared beside him, and Dante's breath caught the way it always did when he saw her now. Keisha Jenkins had transformed over the past 18 months, not just her clothes, though those had changed too. The worn uniforms replaced by professional attire that matched her new position, but something deeper. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. She stood straighter now, spoke louder, took up space in a way she never had when she was just the cook. She was the director of community outreach for the Healing Center. She had an office with her name on the door. She had business cards and a staff and a voice in decisions that affected thousands of people. "I don't know," Dante admitted. "There's a lot of people out there." Keisha smiled and squeezed his hand. There's a lot of people out there because of you, baby. They came to see the boy who saved a billionaire's daughter with kitchen charcoal and his grandfather's wisdom. I had help. You had knowledge. You had courage. You had everything your grandfather gave you. Keisha's eyes glistened. He'd be so proud of you, Dante. So proud. This journey started with a boy who believed his poverty made him nothing. Look at him now. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. The world needs more Dantes. The crowd outside was larger than Dante had expected. Hundreds of people filled the gardens, spilling onto the lawns that had once been strictly off-limits to anyone without a Whitmore invitation. There were families from the surrounding neighborhoods, the communities that had always existed in the shadow of the estate, separated by fences and guard dogs and the invisible walls of class. There were medical professionals who'd traveled from around the world to see this new model of healthcare that combined traditional wisdom with modern medicine. There were journalists and photographers and camera crews capturing every moment. And there in the front row sat Robert and Victoria Whitmore with Emma on Victoria's lap. The baby was thriving now, 22 months old, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes and a laugh that rang out across the garden whenever something delighted her. She'd hit every developmental milestone right on schedule, showing no lasting effects from the poisoning that had nearly killed her. The doctors said it was a miracle. Dante knew it wasn't a miracle. It was activated charcoal and quick thinking, and a grandfather who'd understood that healing was about paying attention to the whole picture, not just the parts you could measure with machines. Robert stood as Dante approached the podium, leading the crowd in applause that washed over Dante like warm rain. 18 months ago, this man had been a distant figure glimpsed through windows, powerful, untouchable, belonging to a world Dante could never enter. Now he was something else, not quite a father, not quite a friend, but something in between, a mentor maybe, a believer. "Thank you all for coming," Robert said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the gardens. 18 months ago, I almost lost my daughter. I had every resource in the world, money, connections, the best medical experts on the planet, and none of it was enough. I was helpless, hopeless, watching my child die while the people I'd paid fortunes couldn't tell me why. He paused, and Dante saw him glance toward the carriage house where Dante and his mother had lived for so many years. The carriage house was still there, but it had been renovated now, expanded, modernized, turned into a guest house for visiting researchers. The Jenkins family had moved into a real home on the property with bedrooms for each of them and a garden where Keisha grew vegetables and a front door that faced the main drive instead of the service entrance. And then a 13-year-old boy broke into my house, Robert continued. Fought past my security guards and saved my daughter's life with knowledge that no medical school teaches. Knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge I had been taught to dismiss as superstition, as folklore, as the uneducated beliefs of people who didn't know any better. His voice cracked slightly. I was the one who didn't know any better. I was the one who'd built walls so high I couldn't see the wisdom standing right outside them. Dante Jenkins taught me that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see most clearly. Robert Whitmore built an empire, but it took a poor black boy to show him what really matters. Dante took the podium with trembling hands. He'd written a speech, practiced it dozens of times in front of his mirror, in front of his mother, in front of Emma's crib while the baby giggled at his nervous pacing. But standing here now, looking out at the sea of faces waiting to hear what he had to say, the words on his note cards felt wrong, too polished, too perfect, too much like someone he wasn't. So he set the cards aside and spoke from his heart. My grandfather's name was Malcolm Jenkins, Dante began. He was born on the south side of Chicago, in a house with no heat and bars on the windows. He never learned past the 8th grade. He never went to college. By every measure the world uses to decide who matters, he was nobody. He looked at the building behind him, at his grandfather's name etched in stone above the entrance. But he saved more lives than most doctors ever will. He delivered babies for mothers who couldn't afford hospitals. He treated fevers with teas when there was no money for medicine. He sat with dying people and held their hands and gave them dignity when they had nothing else. He knew things about plants, about the body, about healing, that he learned from his father, who learned from his father, who learned from generations of people who had to figure out how to survive when no one else would help them. Dante's voice steadied as he spoke. The nervousness was fading, replaced by something stronger. Pride, maybe, or purpose. He used to tell me that our knowledge was our inheritance, not money, not property, just what he put in my head and what I would put in my children's heads someday. He said that knowledge was worth more than gold because no one could ever take it away from you. He thought about the night he'd broken into the mansion, the terror and the certainty and the desperate prayer that he wasn't wrong. For a long time, I was ashamed of that inheritance. I wanted to be modern, educated. I wanted to fit in with a world that looked down on people like my grandfather, that called his knowledge superstition and his wisdom ignorance. I thought that if I could just be smart enough, educated enough, impressive enough, I could escape where I came from. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. Where I come from isn't something to escape. It's something to build on. The knowledge my grandfather gave me saved a baby's life when 19 doctors with degrees from the best universities in the world couldn't figure out what was wrong. That's not despite my background. It's because of it. Because my grandfather taught me to look at the whole picture, to pay attention to the environment, not just the symptoms, to trust what I could see with my own eyes, even when experts were telling me I was wrong. Dante's grandfather never got to see this moment, but his legacy will live forever. Dante looked out at the crowd and saw faces that mirrored his own journey. There were kids from the neighborhood, black and brown kids in hand-me-down clothes, kids who walked to school past mansions they'd never enter, kids who'd been taught by 1,000 small moments that they were less than, not enough, invisible. They were looking at him now with something in their eyes that made his chest tight. Hope, maybe, or recognition. He spoke directly to them. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to walk through the world like you're made of glass. Like the people with money and power could look right through you without ever seeing who you really are. I know what it's like to believe that your poverty makes you nothing, that your circumstances define your worth, that the only way to matter is to become someone completely different from who you were born to be. Dante's voice grew stronger. But I'm standing here today to tell you that's a lie. The things that make you different, your background, your culture, your family's knowledge, the lessons your grandfathers taught you, those aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're strengths to build on. They're perspectives that the world needs, insights that no amount of money can buy, wisdom that gets passed down through generations of people who figured out how to survive and thrive when everything was stacked against them. He gestured to the healing center behind him. This building exists because a boy from a carriage house knew something that 19 doctors didn't. It exists because knowledge matters no matter where it comes from, and it's going to be a place where all knowledge is valued, where the grandmother's remedies sit alongside the surgeon's techniques, where we listen to patients instead of just testing them, where no one is invisible and no one's wisdom is dismissed. Dante took a deep breath. My grandfather used to say that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken in the body. It's about seeing the whole person, their history, their environment, their community, their spirit. It's about treating people with dignity, whether they're billionaires or cooks. It's about remembering that we're all connected, all part of the same human family, all deserving of care and attention and respect. He looked at Robert Whitmore, at his mother, at baby Emma bouncing happily on Victoria's lap. That's what this center is going to be about. That's what my grandfather's legacy is going to mean. Not just a building with his name on it, but a new way of thinking about who gets to be an expert, whose knowledge counts, and how we take care of each other. Dante smiled, a real smile, the kind he used to hide behind walls of invisibility. My name is Dante Jenkins. I'm the cook's son, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that no one like me ever has to feel invisible again. This is Dante's legacy. This is Malcolm Jenkins' legacy. The applause started somewhere in the back and rolled forward like thunder. Dante stood at the podium, overwhelmed, as hundreds of people rose to their feet. He saw tears on faces he didn't recognize, saw children clapping with wild enthusiasm, saw his mother sobbing openly while Robert Whitmore put a steadying hand on her shoulder. And then Emma Whitmore did something that silenced the entire crowd. The toddler squirmed out of her mother's arms, dropped to the ground on unsteady legs, and began walking, toddling really, with that uncertain gait of a child still learning to trust her own feet. Victoria reached for her, but Robert held her back, watching with an expression of wonder as his daughter navigated through the forest of adult legs. Emma walked straight to Dante. She stopped at the edge of the podium, looked up with those bright eyes that had once been clouded with poison, and raised her chubby arms in the universal gesture of children everywhere. Up, pick me up. Dante stepped down from the podium and lifted Emma into his arms. The toddler immediately snuggled against his chest, one small hand fisting in Dante's new suit jacket, utterly content. Day-Day, Emma said clearly, her version of his name. Day-Day. The crowd lost its mind. Dante held the baby close, feeling Emma's heartbeat against his own, strong and steady and alive. This child who had almost died in his arms was now saying his name, reaching for him, trusting him completely. This was what mattered, not the fancy building or the scholarship or the house with his name on the deed. This, a life saved, a connection made, a bridge built between two worlds that had never been meant to touch. Dante looked at the healing center with his grandfather's name on it. He looked at his mother, standing tall and proud for the first time in his memory. He looked at Robert Whitmore, the billionaire who'd learned to kneel. He looked at the crowd full of people who'd come to see a new kind of legacy begin. And he thought about his grandfather, somewhere beyond the veil, watching his grandson stand in the light at last. "Thank you, Grandpa," he thought. "I kept my promise. I used what you taught me when it mattered, and I'm going to keep using it every day for the rest of my life." Emma gurgled happily and patted Dante's face with a sticky hand. Dante laughed, a real laugh, free and joyful and completely unguarded. He wasn't the boy in the shadows anymore. He was Dante Jenkins, healer, teacher, bridge builder, his grandfather's grandson, and his story was just beginning. The end. Thank you for following Dante's incredible journey from the shadows to the light. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about whose voices deserve to be heard, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Remember, you are not invisible. Your background is not a limitation, it's a foundation. And the knowledge you carry, the wisdom your family gave you, the perspective that comes from your unique experience, the world needs all of it. Until next time, stay blessed, stay bold, and never stop believing that one person can change everything. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one, and leave a comment telling us, what wisdom did your grandfather teach you that the world needs to know? See you in the next story.